The morning light crept slowly over the quiet town of Willow Creek, painting the cracked sidewalks and faded rooftops in soft gold. The old stone church stood at the heart of it all, its bell ringing through the mist like a heartbeat calling the faithful. The same faces walked the same paths every Sunday, old men in pressed shirts, women in floral dresses, children tugging at their parents' hands. Everything in Willow Creek moved according to rhythm and routine, and maybe that's why no one saw the change coming, the hum of an engine that didn't belong. It began as a low growl in the distance, growing louder until the sound filled the square. Heads turned, conversations stopped. A black Harley rolled slowly down the street, chrome flashing beneath the morning sun. The man on it was broad-shouldered, his arms inked with intricate tattoos, his jacket worn from miles of wind and regret. His name was Ethan Cole, and though no one knew it yet, he wasn't there to cause trouble. He was there to find peace. For years he had wandered, through cities and deserts, through guilt and silence, running from the man he used to be. But something about this town, this little church with its red door and white cross, had pulled him in like a whisper from somewhere deep inside. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to walk through those doors and ask for forgiveness. But Willow Creek wasn't a place that welcomed men like Ethan, and the man who guarded those doors was not the kind of priest who believed in grace for everyone. The air was thick with the scent of morning rain and incense. The church bells rang slow and steady, each note trembling through the empty streets of Willow Creek, like an old memory refusing to fade. Ethan Cole parked his Harley near the worn stone steps of St. Mary's Church, the engine dying with a deep metallic sigh. For a long moment, he sat there in silence, watching the small congregation filing through the arched doorway. Their faces were familiar to one another, eyes that nodded politely, smiles that didn't reach very far, voices that murmured greetings polished by habit rather than warmth. Ethan knew that kind of world. He had spent years outside of it, on highways, in bars, in deserts that stretched so far they looked like punishment. His hands bore the weight of mistakes he couldn't erase, the tattoos on his arms telling stories no one wanted to read. But that morning, something stronger than shame had pulled him here. He didn't know if it was God, guilt, or simply exhaustion. He only knew he was tired of being the man who watched from a distance. He swung his leg off the bike and stood. The leather of his jacket creaked as he adjusted it, and the people on the steps turned to look. Their whispers were quiet, but not quiet enough. Mothers tightened their grip on their children's hands. An old man crossed himself. Someone muttered the word sinner like it was a curse. Ethan didn't flinch. He'd heard worse in his life, from judges, from cellmates, from the voice in his own head. The priest stood at the entrance, tall, silver-haired, dressed in immaculate white robes that made him look like marble come to life. Father Thomas. His face was the kind that could calm a crowd or condemn a man with a single glance. As Ethan approached, the priest's smile faded. "Can I help you, son?" Father Thomas asked, his voice low, almost courteous. Ethan stopped at the foot of the steps. "Just here to pray," he said. The priest's eyes swept over him, the tattoos on his neck, the worn boots, the chain hanging from his belt. His lips tightened. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere. This is a house of worship." Ethan looked up at the massive wooden doors. "I figured that's exactly why I came." The priest stepped forward, blocking the entrance. His hand lifted, not to bless, but to bar. "The Lord's house is open to those who come in humility," he said sharply. "And from what I see, you bring the world's arrogance with you." The words hit harder than a fist. Ethan could have turned around. He could have walked away like he always did. But something inside him refused to move. For years he'd been called a sinner, a criminal, a lost cause, but never once had he tried to argue. Now, standing there before the church, he realized this was not about his faith being questioned, it was about his humanity being denied. "I'm not here to make trouble," Ethan said quietly. "I just wanted to sit down. Maybe talk to him. Maybe ask for a little forgiveness." The priest's gaze hardened. "Forgiveness is for those who live by his word, not those who mock it with ink and rebellion." Behind them, the murmuring grew. The townspeople gathered in small clusters, watching the confrontation like something forbidden. Some looked curious, some looked entertained, None looked brave enough to speak. And then, cutting through the silence like a small bell of truth, came a voice. "He's more Christian than you." Every head turned. Standing a few steps away was a little girl, no older than 8, wearing a faded yellow dress and holding a worn Bible to her chest. Her name was Lily May, an orphan who helped clean the church every Saturday and sat alone in the front pew every Sunday. Her eyes were wide, fierce, shining with the kind of innocence that made adults uncomfortable. Father Thomas froze. "Lily," he said, trying to steady his tone, "that's enough." But the girl didn't back down. "You told us God loves everyone," she said, voice trembling but strong. "You said no one's too dirty to come inside. Why can't he?" The crowd fell into stunned silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan looked at her, this small defender with trembling hands, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. Father Thomas's face flushed. "Lily," he said, his composure cracking, "you don't understand." "I understand," she interrupted. "You're scaring him away, and Jesus wouldn't do that." Her words echoed through the courtyard. Somewhere deep inside, they hit the very foundation of the church itself. Ethan stood frozen, torn between shame and disbelief. The priest turned toward him, the mask of calm completely gone. "Leave," Father Thomas ordered. His voice was low, dangerous. "Now." Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If that's what God wants." He turned to go, but before he could take a step, Lily ran forward and grabbed his hand. Her tiny fingers clutched his tattooed skin as if she were holding on to something holy. "Don't go," she whispered. "God's listening. He's just waiting for you to talk." The crowd watched, unmoving. No one spoke. No one dared. For a long time, Ethan didn't either. He looked down at the little girl, at the priest, at the faces filled with fear and judgment, and then up at the cross that loomed over them all. The sky had cleared, and sunlight broke through the stained glass windows, spilling colors over the church steps, reds, blues, and golds blending together, bathing Ethan and Lily in light. Zayed felt like something divine was watching. Without another word, Ethan knelt right there on the steps, his hands clasped, his head bowed. The crowd gasped. The priest stepped back, uncertain, and Lily, still holding his hand, knelt beside him. In the silence that followed, Ethan whispered, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but loud enough for heaven to understand. "I don't know if I deserve you," he said, "but if you still want me, I'm here." The wind rose softly, rustling through the trees as if answering him, and for a moment, just a moment, it didn't matter who was inside the church or who was out. It only mattered who had the courage to kneel. Father Thomas turned away, his jaw trembling. He didn't speak again that morning. The people dispersed slowly, their whispers fading into guilt. But one thing lingered in the air, clear and unforgettable, the voice of a little girl who had reminded an entire town what faith was supposed to look like. Ethan stayed there long after everyone left, his eyes closed, his heart breaking open in the sunlight. The church doors remained shut, but somehow for the first time in years he didn't feel locked out. He had found his way back, not to the altar, but to grace. Morning bled slowly into afternoon, but the tension in Willow Creek didn't fade with the light. The story had already spread, not through newspapers or official whispers, but through something faster and far more ruthless: gossip. By the time the church bells struck noon, everyone in town knew about the scene on the steps. They knew about the tattooed biker, the furious priest, and the little girl who had shouted the words that now echoed in every kitchen and shop. "He's more Christian than you." At the diner across the square, two women leaned over their coffee cups, speaking in hushed voices that carried anyway. "I saw him," one said. "Big man, covered in ink, the kind that smells like trouble." The other nodded, stirring her coffee even though she didn't need to. And Father Thomas just stood there. Letting him kneel like that, it's not right. Kids shouldn't see that kind of thing. But not everyone spoke with contempt. At a corner table, Sheriff Miles Carter, a man with more patience than most, listened quietly. He'd known Ethan from another life, the kind of acquaintance forged not by friendship, but by circumstance. Years ago, Ethan had done time for a bar fight gone bad, and Miles had been the one to book him. He remembered the look in Ethan's eyes back then, wild, broken, but not cruel. And this morning, when the sheriff heard what had happened, something in his gut told him the story wasn't as simple as it sounded. Across town, inside the church, Father Thomas sat alone in the pews staring at the crucifix. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass, bathing him in colors that should have been comforting, but now felt like accusation. The silence of the sanctuary pressed against him until it became unbearable. He whispered, "Lord, what have I done?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. For 30 years, Father Thomas had believed in order, that the church's walls were the boundaries of holiness, that purity could be measured by how clean one's hands looked on Sunday. He'd spent his life keeping chaos out, protecting his flock from what he called the noise of the world. But now, after one child's outburst, after one stranger's act of humility, he felt the foundation of that order beginning to crack. He could still hear Lily's voice, the tremor, the defiance, the heartbreaking truth in her words. "He's more Christian than you." Father Thomas rose and paced the aisle, his hands trembling. "I've given everything to this church," he muttered. "Discipline, service, faith. And for what? To be shamed in front of them all?" He gripped the back of a pew, his knuckles white. That man was a sinner. You could see it on his skin. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. He had seen something else in Ethan's eyes. Not arrogance, not rebellion, but pain. And underneath that pain, something terrifyingly pure, surrender. He sank to his knees at the altar. The echo of the morning replayed in his mind, the tattoos, the tears, the child's small hand reaching out. He whispered again, softer this time, "Lord, if I've built your house wrong, how do I rebuild it?" Outside, life went on. Children played in the park, unaware of the storm stirring in the hearts of the adults around them. Lily May sat beneath the old oak tree, flipping through the pages of her worn Bible. She wasn't afraid of what she'd said. Not exactly, but she could feel that something big had shifted, something she didn't yet understand. When she looked up, she saw Ethan sitting on the church steps again. He'd returned quietly, without his bike this time, just a man and his silence. His hands were clasped, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Lily walked over and sat beside him without a word. After a long pause, she said, "You came back." Ethan nodded. "Didn't know where else to go." "Father Thomas is mad," she said softly. "He told Sister Agnes that the devil wears leather now." That made Ethan smile, though it was the kind of smile that hurt to hold. "He's not wrong," he said. "I used to do things I ain't proud of, hurt people, broke a lot more than I fixed." Lily hugged her knees, watching him with the kind of simple honesty only children have. "But you prayed." Ethan looked down at his hands. "Yeah. Didn't feel like it mattered, though." "It did," she said. "You looked like someone God already forgave, even if the priest didn't see it yet." For a moment he couldn't speak. No sermon, no scripture, no theology in his life had ever hit him as hard as that. He looked at her, this little girl with scuffed shoes and a heart too big for her small frame, and felt the first fragile thread of peace begin to form. Back inside, Father Thomas stared at the same pew where the two of them had knelt hours earlier. He heard their voices faintly through the stained glass, and felt something inside him shift again. Pride, fear, shame, it all tangled until it became unbearable. He sat down and buried his face in his hands. That evening he couldn't bring himself to ring the bell for Vespers. The church stayed silent as twilight fell. For the first time in decades, Father Thomas skipped evening prayers. Instead, he walked through the rain to the old rectory behind the church, where the weight of his collar felt heavier than ever. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and stared out the window. Across the street he saw them, Ethan and Lily, still sitting on the steps, drenched but unbothered. The sight was both humbling and painful. The child he'd baptized now teaching him what grace looked like. He whispered to no one, "Maybe faith isn't meant to keep men out. Maybe it's meant to bring them in." The next morning the town's gossip burned brighter. Some called Father Thomas weak, others said he'd been right to protect the sanctity of the church. And through it all Ethan kept returning, sitting quietly outside every day, never forcing his way in, never leaving either. The townsfolk began to notice. Some walked by, pretending not to see him. Others left small things beside him, a loaf of bread, a cup of coffee, a folded note that simply said, "Praying for you." And slowly, the narrative began to turn. In every town, there's a moment when people see themselves too clearly, when judgment becomes a mirror instead of a weapon. For Willow Creek, that mirror had arrived. Father Thomas stood again before the altar that Sunday, his voice trembling as he began the sermon. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "I was wrong." The church stirred, heads turned, the air thickened with disbelief. "I was wrong to decide who is worthy of God's house. I was wrong to mistake appearance for sin and silence for purity." His voice cracked. "And I was blind to the truth that faith lives not in how we look, but in how we love." Through the stained glass window, sunlight broke in. Outside, Ethan sat on the steps, unaware of what was being said, or maybe he knew, because for the first time in years, he smiled without regret. And inside, Father Thomas finally understood that God had sent him a teacher dressed in leather, not linen. The air in Willow Creek had changed. It wasn't something people could name, but everyone felt it, a quiet tension, like the stillness before a storm or the breath held between words. The church stood at the center of it all, silent and watching, as if waiting to see which way grace would fall. For days after the incident, Ethan kept returning to the church steps. Every morning he arrived early, sitting cross-legged beside his parked Harley, sipping coffee from a chipped thermos. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't demand entry. He just sat, a man who seemed to be waiting not for forgiveness, but for the chance to prove he no longer feared it. The townspeople had grown used to him by now. Children whispered his name like a legend. Adults pretended indifference, though their eyes always drifted toward him. Even the sheriff, Miles Carter, had stopped by once or twice, not to move him along, but to nod, to make sure the world remembered civility. Inside the church, Father Thomas was restless. His sermons had changed, softer now, but unsure, as though each word he spoke required God's approval before it left his lips. He prayed longer these days, not for miracles, but for clarity. For years he had been certain of everything. Now certainty felt like a sin. On the fourth morning after the confrontation, he finally gathered the courage to step outside. Ethan was sitting as always, his hands clasped, head bowed. The sun was low, slicing through the trees and painting the steps in streaks of amber. Father Thomas hesitated at the doorway. His instinct told him to retreat, to keep the walls between himself and the man who had shaken his faith. But another voice, softer and older, whispered from somewhere deep inside, "Go to him." He took a breath and descended the steps. The click of his shoes echoed against the stone. Ethan looked up, surprised but calm. His face was rough, his beard unkempt, but his eyes, there was a steadiness there, the kind born from years of breaking and rebuilding oneself. "Morning, Father," Ethan said quietly. "Didn't expect you to come out." Father Thomas folded his hands behind his back. "I imagine not. Truth be told, I didn't expect myself to." A faint smile touched Ethan's lips. "Guess God works in strange ways." The priest nodded, though the words tasted like irony. "He does indeed." He paused, searching for what to say. "You've been sitting here every day. Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Don't know. Habit, maybe. Or maybe I just like being close. Don't feel right walking away yet." The priest's gaze drifted to the worn leather jacket draped over the Harley's seat. On the back was a small silver cross tied to a chain. Simple, old, tarnished by time. "That yours?" he asked. Ethan looked over his shoulder. "Yeah, found it on the side of the road a few years back. Figured someone up there was telling me to hold on to it." He ran his thumb across the metal absently. "Didn't feel like I had the right to wear one before. Still don't." Father Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Faith isn't a medal you earn. It's a wound you tend to." Ethan chuckled softly. "Then I guess I've been bleeding for a long time." The priest's eyes softened, though his pride resisted it. "I've been guilty of turning faith into a contest of appearances. I judged you before I knew you." Ethan tilted his head. "You were just protecting what you believe in." "No," Father Thomas said, shaking his head. "I was protecting myself, my image of holiness, my fear of being wrong." He sighed. When that little girl shouted at me, it felt like God himself was holding a mirror to my face. They sat in silence for a while. The town moved around them, car engines humming, birds calling from rooftops, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as two men tried to learn the language of humility. After a moment, Ethan said, "You ever wonder if people like me even get second chances?" Father Thomas looked at him. "Every morning I wonder if I do." The answer hung between them, heavy but honest. Then the priest reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross, smooth from years of prayer. He turned it over in his fingers before holding it out. "Here. I carved this when I first became a priest. I used to carry it everywhere, but somewhere along the way I stopped needing to touch it. Or maybe I just stopped deserving to." Ethan hesitated before taking it. His rough, oil-stained hands looked almost sacred as they closed around the fragile wood. "You sure you want to give this to me?" Father Thomas smiled faintly. "Consider it a trade. You carry the cross, and I'll carry the chain. Maybe between the two of us, we'll remember what it means." Ethan looked at the chain on his bike, then unclipped the small silver cross from it. He placed it in the priest's palm. "Guess it's your turn to hold on to something imperfect." For the first time in years, Father Thomas laughed, quietly, genuinely. The sound startled them both. That afternoon they spoke for hours, not about doctrine or theology, but about life, the kind of confessions that don't fit inside a booth. Ethan told him about his time on the road, the anger that followed him like a shadow, the nights he'd wished he'd never wake. The priest listened, not as a judge, but as a man hearing echoes of his own failures in another voice. When Ethan finished, Father Thomas said, "You know, I once told a boy that God only listens to the pure of heart. But now I think God listens to whoever still dares to speak." Ethan looked down at the small wooden cross in his hand. "Then maybe it's time I start talking again." The next Sunday, something extraordinary happened. The church doors stood open before Mass. No guards, no hesitation. The townspeople arrived as usual, murmuring, cautious, and stopped when they saw Father Thomas standing at the entrance. Beside him stood Ethan, dressed simply in a clean shirt and the same worn jeans, the faint glint of the wooden cross visible at his neck. Some gasped, others frowned, but no one moved. Father Thomas cleared his throat. "This house," he said, voice steady, "belongs to God, and God doesn't lock his doors." He stepped aside. Ethan looked uncertain, but the priest nodded gently. Together they walked down the aisle. The murmurs swelled like a tide, but no one stopped them. Ethan took a seat in the last pew, bowing his head. Father Thomas climbed the pulpit, his hands trembling slightly. "Forgiveness," he began, "isn't about forgetting sin. It's about facing it without turning away." His gaze swept across the congregation. "And sometimes, it takes a stranger to remind us who we claim to be." In that moment, silence filled the church. Not the cold silence of judgment, but the fragile stillness of understanding. Outside, Lily May watched through the open door, her small face breaking into a smile. She clutched her little Bible tight, whispering, "Told you so." And for the first time in Willow Creek's long history, the morning light shining through the stained glass touched both sinner and priest the same way. Soft, warm, equal. The cross and the chain had changed hands, but the faith that bound them had found its way home. The days that followed were quiet, but the quiet felt different, charged, watchful, like the town itself was holding its breath. The people of Willow Creek had built their lives around routine, around the safety of sameness. But after that Sunday, after seeing the tattooed biker sitting calmly in the back pew, after hearing Father Thomas's trembling confession from the pulpit, something inside the town's order cracked. It wasn't chaos that seeped through. It was reflection. In a place like Willow Creek, gossip had always been the closest thing to Scripture. For years, stories moved faster than truth ever could, shaping reputations like clay. But now, those same whispers carried a new kind of weight. They were no longer about him, about the sinner who dared to sit among the saved. They were about them, about what it meant to call oneself righteous while standing on shaky ground. At the diner, the same two women who'd once spoken sharply about Ethan now stirred their coffee in uneasy silence. One finally said, "You know, I used to pray every night for my son to stop drinking. Never once thought to pray for the man who sold him the bottles." The other nodded slowly, eyes downcast. "We've all got our sins, don't we? Just easier to see the ones painted on someone else's skin." Across town, the sheriff sat on his porch polishing his badge. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that justice and mercy rarely lived in the same house. But watching Ethan every morning, the way he helped Mrs. Caldwell carry her groceries, the way he fixed the school's broken fence without being asked, made Miles rethink what redemption looked like. Maybe it wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about building something honest on top of it. By the end of the week, even the children sensed the shift. They no longer whispered about the biker with fear or excitement. Instead, they waved when they saw him ride by, and Ethan, who'd forgotten how to wave back without irony, learned again. He'd become something unexpected, not a symbol of rebellion, but a mirror the town couldn't ignore. Inside the church, Father Thomas watched all of it unfold with a mixture of awe and guilt. Each evening, after the pews emptied and the last candles burned low, he'd kneel at the altar and think about how blind he'd been. For years, he'd preached about salvation as if it were a prize at the end of a flawless life. But Ethan's quiet persistence, his humility, had shown him something different, that grace doesn't arrive when you earn it. It arrives when you stop pretending you ever could. And yet the transformation of the town didn't come without resistance. Not everyone liked the change. Some of the old guard, the men who'd sat on the church council for decades, gathered in back rooms to mutter their discontent. "He's turning this place into a circus," one said. "Next thing you know, we'll have drunks and thieves at the altar." Another scoffed. "He's soft. This new priest of ours is letting shame parade around like virtue." They didn't see what the others saw, that their anger was just fear in disguise. Fear of losing control, fear of facing the truth that righteousness had always been a mask they wore too tightly. One evening, Father Thomas walked home under a sky streaked with the colors of fading light. The air was thick with the smell of rain. As he turned the corner near the general store, he found Ethan kneeling beside a broken window, helping a young boy pick up shattered glass. "Kid broke it by accident," Ethan said, glancing up. "Didn't want to tell his dad, thought he'd be mad." Father Thomas knelt beside them, his old bones protesting. Together, they picked up the pieces, small, sharp reminders of how fragile things could be. When they finished, the priest looked at Ethan and said, "You've done more healing for this town with your hands than I ever did with my sermons." Ethan smiled faintly. "Nah, Father. You started it. I just lit the fuse." The priest shook his head. "No, God lit it. We just stopped running from the fire." That night, something remarkable happened. A group of townspeople gathered outside the church, not for mass, not for spectacle, but for silence. They stood under the moonlight one by one, confessing not to a priest but to one another. Mrs. Caldwell admitted she hadn't spoken to her sister in 15 years, over a lie neither could remember. The butcher confessed he'd been raising his prices unfairly, blaming the market. Even Sheriff Miles, standing in the back, admitted aloud that he'd once let a guilty man go because the man's brother had been his friend. No judgment, no punishment, just the sound of rain beginning to fall, soft, cleansing. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, watching it all unfold. His heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. For so long he'd believed he was the worst thing he'd ever done. But now, looking at these people laying down their pride in the open air, he realized that everyone carried their own version of his scars, just hidden under better clothes. Father Thomas stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. "This town has spent years polishing its image," he said, his voice carrying in the rain. "But mirrors don't lie. We see what we are. The question is, what will we do now that we've seen it?" No one answered, but no one turned away either, and maybe that was the beginning of something sacred. As the crowd dispersed, Lily May ran up to Ethan, her hair plastered to her forehead by the rain. She handed him a small scrap of paper, folded and damp. "It's a prayer I wrote," she said, smiling shyly. Ethan unfolded it. In a child's messy handwriting, it read, "Dear God, thank you for sending someone who made grown-ups tell the truth again, and please don't let him leave. Lily." Ethan's throat tightened. He looked down at her, trying to find words that wouldn't break. "You're something else, kid," he said. She grinned. "I know." As they walked back toward the church, the rain finally stopped. The puddles on the street shimmered under the lamplight, reflecting everything: the steeple, the cross, the old brick walls, and two figures walking side by side, one dressed in black leather, the other in white robes. For the first time, the town's reflection looked honest. Not perfect, but real. And sometimes, in a world built on appearances, real was the closest thing to holy. Father Thomas looked over at Ethan and said quietly, "You know, I think we've both been praying for the same thing all along." Ethan smiled. "Yeah? What's that?" The priest's eyes softened. "For the truth, even when it hurts." The two men stopped at the church steps. The air smelled of wet earth and redemption. Inside, the candles flickered faintly through the stained glass, their light painting the pews in fragments of red and gold. And for the first time in Willow Creek's long memory, the church didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a mirror. The summer sun had begun to fade behind the hills, and the streets of Willow Creek were washed in that late-day gold that made everything, the houses, the trees, even the cracked sidewalks, look almost holy. Months had passed since the morning the little girl had shouted her truth to the world, and the town had never been the same since. The gossip had quieted, the sneers had softened, and the church that once stood like a wall now breathed like a living thing. The doors were always open now, and sometimes you could find people inside even after dark, not praying for appearances, but talking to the silence like it might finally answer back. Ethan had become part of that silence. Every day he came to the church not as a spectacle, but as a worker. He fixed broken pews, mended leaking pipes, painted the old fence behind the graveyard where time had peeled away the color. He never asked for payment. He said the work itself was enough. To most of the town, he was no longer the biker. He was Ethan, the man who showed up when something needed repairing. But there was still one thing he hadn't fixed, one piece of his life that lingered like a splinter beneath the skin: his past. One evening, as he packed up his tools, Sheriff Miles approached from the edge of the lot. The sun caught the badge on his chest, turning it to fire. "Got a letter for you," he said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "Came through the county office. Return address says State Correctional Facility, Lincoln County." Ethan froze. He knew the name before he even opened it. David Cole. His younger brother, the one he hadn't spoken to in over a decade, the one whose name he'd carried like a wound. He took the letter with hands that weren't steady and stared at it for a long time. Finally, he muttered, "Guess the past finally found the road back." The sheriff nodded. "Whatever it says, you don't have to face it alone anymore." That night, Ethan sat on the church steps beneath the stained glass glow and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was jagged, like someone who'd fought too long against his own words. "Ethan, they told me you changed. Said you found God or something. I laughed when I heard it, but now I don't know. I got maybe 6 months left in here. Too many fights, too many bad choices. You tried to save me once, and I pushed you away. I blamed you for everything. But it wasn't you. It was me. I just didn't want to admit you were the better man. If you can forgive me before I go, I'll die lighter. David." The words blurred as Ethan's eyes burned. For a long while, he didn't move. The church bell rang somewhere far above him, and the sound scattered through the empty streets like falling glass. He thought of all the nights he'd spent angry at God, demanding to know why forgiveness was always asked of those who'd already been broken. Now he understood. Forgiveness wasn't mercy for the guilty. It was medicine for the living. The next morning, Ethan went to Father Thomas's quarters. The priest was polishing the silver chalice, his face calm but weary. When he saw Ethan, he smiled. "You look like a man standing on the edge of something." "I got a letter," Ethan said, placing it on the table. "From my brother." Father Thomas read it silently, his eyes narrowing with emotion. "Will you go to him?" Ethan nodded. "If I don't, everything I've learned here means nothing. Guess grace don't count unless you're willing to carry it where it hurts." The priest placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then take it with you, son. Not the kind I preach, the kind you lived." 2 days later, Ethan rode out of Willow Creek. The Harley thundered down the highway, a black streak beneath the wide-open sky. For the first time in years, the road didn't feel like escape. It felt like pilgrimage. The prison sat on the edge of the desert, a sun-bleached fortress surrounded by miles of dust and silence. Inside, time moved slower, heavier. When Ethan walked through the gates, the guards eyed his tattoos, his rough clothes, the small wooden cross at his neck. They led him down a corridor that smelled of rust and bleach until they reached a visiting room. Steel table, flickering light, 2 chairs. When David entered, Ethan barely recognized him. The boy he'd once known, reckless, sharp-tongued, burning with defiance, was gone. In his place stood a man carved down to his bones, grey at the edges, eyes hollow but awake. Neither spoke at first. They just sat there, years of silence pressing between them like another wall that needed tearing down. Finally, Ethan said, "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." David shrugged, his voice raw. "Didn't think you'd want to." "Wasn't about wanting," Ethan said. "Was about not knowing how." David leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You ever think maybe we were both too proud to admit we were scared?" Ethan smiled sadly. "All the time." The conversation stretched on, awkward and halting at first, then flowing like a river breaking through a dam. They spoke about the past, about their parents' deaths, about the fights that drove them apart, about the night David got arrested and Ethan didn't show up to bail him out. Each confession landed heavy, but none were dodged. When visiting hours ended, David stood and said quietly, "I don't know if God forgives people like me." Ethan met his eyes. "He does, but sometimes he makes us carry each other's forgiveness till we're ready to believe it." They hugged, clumsy, brief, real. And when Ethan walked out into the blazing desert air, something inside him uncoiled. The burden he'd carried for half his life loosened, not gone, but lighter. He returned to Willow Creek 3 days later. The town was hosting its annual summer fair, the first one in years without the bitterness of division shadowing it. Children ran through the square, laughter spilling through the air. The church bells rang not for ceremony but for celebration. Father Thomas met him by the gate, his eyes bright with relief. "How was it?" Ethan smiled, weary but free. "Hard, good, real." He looked toward the church. "Guess forgiveness costs more than we think, but it's worth every drop." That night, the town gathered outside the church for a service under the stars. No pews, no walls, just people standing on the grass holding candles that flickered like tiny beating hearts. Father Thomas spoke softly. "Grace isn't found in perfection. It's found in the dust, where we fall, where we rise, where we choose to stay." When he finished, he stepped aside and motioned for Ethan to speak. Ethan hesitated, then walked forward, the wooden cross glinting against his chest. "I used to think faith was about being clean, about keeping your hands from getting dirty. But now I know it's the opposite. It's about reaching into the mess, into the hurt, into the parts nobody wants to touch. That's where you find God. Not up there," he said, pointing to the sky, "but down here, with us, in the dust." For a long time, no one moved. Then slowly people began to kneel, one by one, young and old, sinner and saint alike. The field shimmered with candlelight, and the air hummed with quiet prayers that didn't need words. Father Thomas stood beside Ethan, whispering, "You've done more for this town than I ever could." Ethan shook his head. "Nah, Father, I just reminded him that grace ain't something you preach. It's something you live." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain over the hills. Somewhere beyond the valley, thunder rolled, not in warning this time, but in blessing. And as the first drops began to fall, mixing with the candlelight and the dust, Ethan lifted his face to the sky and closed his eyes. The rain felt like absolution, cold, real, infinite. For the first time in a lifetime of running, he wasn't searching anymore. He was home.